So I have had a really, really great day at Space-Comm. It's been really informative, really inspiring. It's got me really excited about the space and the dynamism in the space and everything that's going on. So while it's fresh in my mind, before I drive home, I wanted to give you my 5 takeaways. And the first one is, a lot of times we think that aviation, aerospace, space is kind of the same type of sector. In one way it kind of is, but there are some key differences. And what stood out for me today is the fact that aerospace and space are in 2 very different places right now. So aerospace is very much about the design and components and everything related to aircraft and spacecraft. And space is about the bigger space sector. So satellites, launch capability, space travel, missions, loads of different things that are in space. So yes, spacecrafts, but so much more than that. And what stood out for me today is that aerospace and space are in different spaces. And so aerospace, you see a lot of very well established companies that are very rooted in tradition, rooted in the way things have always been done, rooted in a very regimented and a very structured way of working. And because both space, aviation, aerospace are so rooted in safety, that's understandable. But then the aerospace sector is less dynamic. It's less innovative, less forward thinking than what you're seeing in space, particularly new space, and looking at the launch capability in commercial space and the commercialization of space and launch capability from the UK, and just the innovation that is happening and the new entrants, and what you're seeing is quite different. So even though they're close in terms of what they do and the shared technology, and a lot of space companies will also be aerospace companies, even though there is that connection, they're in a very different season, a very, very different season. So that was really interesting to me, and probably something that I'll talk more about in future content. The other thing is that in space there are a lot of new entrants. So these are companies that are established in other sectors that are coming into space because of the opportunity that there is now in the space sector. It's also, you're seeing a lot of partnerships with education institutions, so educational institutions and commercial companies. So you're seeing a lot of innovation coming through from universities as well. A lot of, the UK Space Agency funds a lot of initiatives that start in universities and things like that. And so you're seeing a lot more new entrants in space, both in terms of startups and in terms of companies that are moving into the space sector than you are in aerospace as well. So yeah, that's what struck me, the number of new companies, which is testament to the opportunities that you're seeing in space and the commercialization of space. So it's an exciting arena. So that was interesting as well. The third thing is the focus on the UK launch capability, and the focus on the UK being a leader in the launch of satellites and the launch of small vehicles into space. But when they were speaking about this, so I've spoken about this in a previous video in my 10 takeaways from the UK space strategy. But what was interesting that one of the panelists said, is that it's not enough to understand that the UK wants to be a specialist in, or a leader in launch capability. It's about why, and understanding that launch is part of a bigger ecosystem. It's not just that the UK just wants to launch rockets for the sake of it, or launch satellites rather for the sake of it. It's about the wider benefit to humanity, and it's about educating the public, educating everyone, to be honest, about, okay, so we want to launch and we want to be a leader in launch, but why? what is the benefit to humanity? And I think there's a lot to talk about in that area, and it's an area that I'll be probably talking about a lot more in future videos as I unpack it. The fourth thing was the conundrum that is regulation. There's the FAA and the CAA, which is the US Regulatory Authority and the UK Regulatory Authority for Aviation, Aerospace and Space. They're having to create a regulatory framework that doesn't currently exist. The foundations of it, yes, but what's happening in space has never been done before. So the regulation and the framework for regulation and around safety is a minefield. And so it only struck me today about what a minefield that is, but they're doing a great job of addressing it and exploring it. But it's that balance between having regulation in place so that commercial entities can, yes, have freedom to explore and innovate, but there's parameters and there's safety, and without over-regulating. So I wouldn't want that job, but what was reassuring about today is that there's some great minds in that space, and the fact that international regulatory bodies are working together, like the FAA and the CAA, working together to really kind of, as far as possible, standardize some of this regulation and learn from each other. So yeah, regulation is a minefield, but it's also interesting, the legalities and the parameters around space and things like the amount of satellites that maybe can actually be in space, and various things, and just loads of stuff that are over my head. But it was just interesting to hear that the thinking around that today. So that was interesting. One thing to say about that is the need for regulation has largely been born out of the growth of the industry. So there's a 30% growth in launches since the year 2000. This year alone, there are 100 US launches of satellite aircraft into space, and that's like, on average, the representative from the FAA was saying like something is launched into space every 3 days. There's a launch into space every 3 days, which is wild. So giving licenses and regulating that is no easy task. And as the industry grows at the rate that it's growing at, there's increasing complexity around that. The fifth thing is, and this is both exciting and no, it's just exciting. No one actually knows what the space sector is going to look like in the next 5 years. Like, we don't know. Not even the regulators know. Like, this is literally a new frontier, and that's really exciting. Really, really exciting. And linked to that was the fact that one of the speakers said, a space startup said, that what's really fascinating is that because we have a number of regional hubs that have heavy investment into space, like Harwell, like Wales, like Scotland, like the Midlands, we're moving into a time where having a career in space is something people had in childhood, right? So when you were younger, you may have wanted to be an astronaut or whatever, venture into space. And then as you get older, it's one of those career paths where you think, that's wild, that's just a dream, I could never do that. But we're coming into a time with these regions that are heavily focused on space where people will know people down the road that are astronauts or that are engineers or that work in the space sector. And so I love that we're coming into a time where we're educating the generation coming up about the fact that you can have a successful career in space. It's not a pipe dream, it's a reality, and actually we need more people to work in space. So those are my 5 points for you, just to summarize what they are. So first, the difference between aerospace and space, and that they're in a very different space. Aerospace is still very much stuck in tradition, and space is really dynamic and forward thinking at the moment. 2, there are a lot of new entrants into the space sector, both in terms of startups and companies that are established in other sectors that are moving into space. 3, that the UK launch capability is not just about being a center of excellence when it comes to launching particularly small objects and small satellites, small vehicles, but it's about understanding what is the human benefit of launching and strengthening our launch capability and the education that is required around that. 4 is the challenge of regulation and the fact that the industry is growing at 30% a year since 2020, and this year alone in the US we have 100 launches, averaging like 3 launches a day. And so regulatory matters regarding that and licenses and things for companies is a minefield. But we're making good headway. So CAA and FAA are making good headway. And then 5th, that no one knows what the future holds, but what we do know is that there are some great opportunities in space for the generation coming up. So those are my takeaways. I've had a great day, and I'm excited about the next kind of industry conference expo event we'll be attending. And I'll bring you along next time as well. So now we are heading home. Speak to you soon.